Welcome to Betrayal Stories. In today's video script, the door clicked softly behind us, sealing the world outside and leaving me in the quiet stillness of the moment. My chest fluttered not from anything physical, but from the uncertainty of what the night might bring. The room felt charged with something unspoken. He moved with a kind of quiet confidence that only age and experience can give a person. And then, almost in the same breath, I sensed a second presence steady.com, unexpectedly close. I had only anticipated meeting one of them, but with both standing there now, watching me with equal attention, I knew the evening ahead was going to unfold in ways I hadn't yet imagined. Before I tell you how everything truly happened, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it makes sure you don't miss what comes next. The full story, PG-13. 6,000 plus words approx. 6,800 words. I never thought a single quiet evening would turn into a turning point in my life. An emotional shift so deep that it would test what I believed about connection, trust, and the complicated layers of the human heart. But that night began like so many others. Me sitting alone, pretending not to care that I had long grown exhausted by men my age. There was always something. Missing rushed conversations, shallow intentions, and a constant need for attention that left no room for listening. Younger men moved too fast in every sense, as though slowing down would expose something fragile. They spoke to impress, not to understand. They approached everything in life like a race, and I had grown tired of running. Sitting in the cafe that evening, stirring my drink with idle circles, I found myself slipping into that familiar, quiet frustration. I kept wondering why no one seemed to truly see me, or why genuine conversation felt like a lost art for a long time. I had carried a quiet thought I never dared to voice. Maybe someone older would understand me better. That was when I noticed them. Two men both in their 50s. Walked in with a steady, grounded presence that shifted the energy of the entire room. They were dressed sharply, but not ostentatiously. Worn in a way that suggested they understood exactly who they were and had nothing to prove. They didn't scan the room for validation. They simply moved through it as though the world had already taught them everything they needed to know. One caught my glance first. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened, as if he recognized a thought I hadn't realized was written across my face. The second man followed his gaze, and a faint smile shaped his lips warm. Easy. Almost knowing I felt the heat rise in my cheeks when they chose the two empty seats beside me. "You look like you're waiting for someone," the first man said. His voice was low, steady, unhurried. "Or maybe hoping someone shows up." The second added, his tone lighter, playful without trying too hard. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Or maybe just tired of the wrong kind of company." "And what's the right kind?" the first man asked, leaning slightly forward. Not invading my space, but holding it with enough presence to make me feel seen. Someone who doesn't waste my time. I answered before I could stop myself. The honesty surprised me as much as it did them. They exchanged a small look, silent, but full of understanding. Experience usually takes care of that. The second said that word experience held more weight than it should have. Not because of anything romantic or suggestive, but because it was exactly what had been missing from my life. Maturity, patience, depth. The conversation that followed flowed effortlessly. They teased me about my drink. I teased them about their calm confidence. They listened to really listened on. They didn't interrupt each other or try to dominate the moment. It felt like they were practiced in understanding people, in observing without assuming. In reading between the lines, it felt like for the first time in a long time I was sitting with people who understood the power of a quiet moment. "Tell me," the first man asked eventually, "what's someone like you doing here alone?" "Maybe I was waiting for you," I replied, half teasing, half truthful. The second man tilted his head. "Both of us." I smiled without meaning to. "I didn't say that." "You didn't say no," he countered gently. A warm, charged silence fell between us. Not suggestive, simply full of potential. A kind I hadn't felt in a long time. It was the feeling of being at the beginning of something and not knowing where it might lead. When the first man finally spoke, his voice was softer. Maybe we should leave. My stomach fluttered with that strange mix of fear and excitement that only comes with stepping into the unknown. And go where? My place, he said. It's nearby. The second leaned in slightly. Closer than you think. I hesitated. Not because I felt unsafe, quite the opposite, but because I realized how rare it was to feel genuinely comfortable around two strangers. Something intuitive, almost instinctual, told me I wasn't walking into danger. I was walking into an experience that would teach me something deep about myself. So I nodded, and that's how the evening began. The RID, when we stepped outside, the air was cool against my skin. I barely noticed. My thoughts moved too quickly. As they walked on either side of me, a protective formation more than anything else. One of them opened the rideshare door, and the gesture was simple but thoughtful. I slid into the back seat. The second man sat beside me while the first took his place in the front. City lights brushed across the windows like moving brushstrokes. The car hummed softly. And the quiet settled around us in a way that felt intimate but not inappropriate. You're quiet now. The man beside me murmured. Maybe I'm just thinking, I replied. About what? The man in front asked, glancing at me through the mirror. I didn't answer, not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't untangle the thoughts fast enough to shape them into words. The man beside me leaned closer. Not touching me, simply creating a space where I didn't feel rushed. You don't have to say anything. And somehow that helped more than any reassurance I'd ever been given. The ride blurred by. Not because anything happened, but because nothing needed to. Silence felt natural with them, comfortable, which in itself was rare. When the car slowed and stopped, I realized we had arrived without me noticing the passing time. The APRTM&T, their apartment, was warm, softly lit, and surprisingly inviting. The living room was spacious, with shelves lined not with expensive displays, but with books well used, dog-eared, the kind that showed a life full of curiosity. Make yourself comfortable, one of them said. Taking my coat, I didn't miss the gentleness in the gesture. The second returned with a drink, non-alcoholic, which made me trust them even more. They weren't trying to loosen my thoughts. They were trying to understand them. Sit, he said, motioning to the couch. One sat beside me, angled toward me, offering the kind of attention that didn't feel overwhelming. The other leaned against the armrest across from me, his expression patient, observant. They didn't move quickly. They didn't push for anything. They didn't even sit too close. It was simply two people creating space for me to breathe. You're trembling. One of them said. I hadn't even noticed. Am I? I whispered. Just a little, he replied. Long day? I nodded. What followed wasn't a progression of physical closeness. It was emotional closeness. Built through conversation that unfolded slowly, thoughtfully, and with an honesty I wasn't used to receiving. They asked questions, not probing or invasive, but meaningful. What did I want from life? What made me feel understood? When had I last felt seen? And for the first time, I answered without guarding myself. The SHIFT as the night deepened, I became aware of something shifting inside, may not because of them, but because of what their presence revealed. I had spent years building walls around myself, convinced no one would ever understand me the way I needed to be understood. I had learned to accept half attention as enough. I had grown accustomed to silence that wasn't comforting. But here, sitting between two men who listened with care and spoke with intention, I felt something unfamiliar. Comfort. Safety. A release of tension I didn't know I carried. None of this was romantic in a typical sense. It was something more complex, and emotional chemistry built from wisdom and patience rather than adrenaline. They didn't flirt. They didn't touch. They didn't crowd my space. They simply existed beside me in a way that made me feel like I mattered. The truth, they satired eventually. The first man spoke with a seriousness that made my breath pause. There's something you should know. The room grew quiet. We didn't approach you because we wanted something from you, he said. We approached you because we recognized something familiar in you. The second nodded. You reminded us of someone we once knew. I felt my heartbeat quicken. Who? I asked. He exhaled slowly. Someone who spent too much time around the wrong people and forgot what it felt like to be heard. They told me about her, a woman they both cared about deeply. A friend who faded into the background of her own life because no one ever slowed down long enough to see her. We didn't want that for you, the first man said. And we don't want you to think you're alone. Either, the second added. Their words hit deeper than I expected. You barely know me, I whispered. Sometimes, the first man said. You recognize someone before you know them. And somehow, I understood exactly what he meant. The moment of CLR right wasn't romance. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't tension. It was connection. The rare kind. The kind that forms between people who understand the weight of loneliness, the importance of being seen, and the quiet hope that someone might understand them without being told. For years, I had thought I wanted younger men because they were exciting, unpredictable, full of energy. But excitement doesn't compare to calm. Unpredictability doesn't compare to understanding. Energy doesn't compare to emotional presence. And sitting there with them, realized something that would stay with me far beyond that night. I wasn't looking for passion. I was looking for peace. What happened next? We talked for hours about life, its past regrets, lessons learned, dreams abandoned and rediscovered. Their experiences weren't intimidating. They were grounding. Their stories weren't warnings. They were guideposts. When the night finally drew to a close, nothing dramatic happened. No moment of sudden confession, no romantic gesture, no physical contact that crossed boundaries, just three people sitting in the glow of soft light, finding a rare kind of understanding when they finally walked me to the door. The first man said, You trusted us tonight. Thank you, the second added. And if you ever need someone to talk to again, we're here. I stepped outside into the cool air, feeling strangely lighter. Not because anything extraordinary had happened, but because for the first time in years, I felt something I had forgotten how to feel. Seen, valued, understood without being used. And that changed everything. The REFLSTUN, the days that followed. I couldn't stop thinking about them, not in a romantic way, but in a reflective one. They represented a kind of companionship I had never experienced before. Calm, measured, thoughtful. Genuine. I used to think emotional intimacy required romance, but they taught me something different. Sometimes the most transformative connections are the ones that happen unexpectedly. Without labels or expectations, they taught me that maturity isn't about age, it's about presence. That understanding isn't about knowing someone's history, it's about listening. And that connection doesn't always lead to love, but it always leads to growth. The REL, Leah, Tio, and what? I realized that night was this. I didn't want one older man. I didn't want older men. I didn't want younger men. I didn't want excitement or chaos or adrenaline. What I truly wanted was emotional depth. Someone who understood the value of silence. Someone who didn't fear vulnerability. Someone who approached connection with patience instead of hunger. Someone who didn't see me as an escape or distraction. Someone who saw me and those two men strangers, who became mirrors, helped me understand the kind of person I was waiting for all along. The question for why oh so, now I want to ask you something. If you had been in that apartment, in that quiet, thoughtful, unexpected moment, would you have had the emotional steadiness to be present? Would you have listened without assuming? Would you have understood without taking? Would you have stayed grounded enough to guide someone through their uncertainty? Or would you have let the moment slip into misunderstanding? Be honest in the comments. I've read every single one. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Your support means more than you know, and it keeps these stories alive.